Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland or 7 or just a little past it here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart, and as always, weeknights we have our usual smorgasbord of news, international and domestic, from a Scottish perspective. And happy Valentine's Day, and of course, adding to the joy of today here at Broadcasting Scotland, we like to be joined by one of our glamorous colleagues. So for tonight, you've got two guys with beards. William, welcome to the programme and delighted to have you with us.
Hello, I feel like a sort of Cupid, but there we are. A bearded Cupid. Hello.
Hello, I shall try my best not to be hit by your arrows. However, we start as we always do on a more serious matter, which is of course day 356 of the illegal Russian attack upon the sovereign state of Ukraine. In our Ukrainian update, and a major new Russian offensive we hear has begun, according to NATO's General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg. Speaking ahead of a two-day meeting of NATO defence ministers in Brussels on Monday, Stoltenberg said that Russia was sending more troops, more weapons, more capabilities. He also said that it was more important that Finland and Sweden's applications to join the alliance were ratified quickly than ratified together. The two countries applied to join NATO following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and their membership bids have been ratified by all of the allies except two, those being Hungary and Turkey. Turkey is widely seen as the main hold-up. Ankara has demanded that both countries take a tougher line against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK as they are known, which is considered a terrorist group by Turkey and also by the European Union. Ukraine has urgent requirements in terms of more military aid, the US Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin has said today, and he also reaffirmed that the United States and NATO allies in general were there to support Ukraine over the long haul. Russia has once more criticised NATO over its stance towards the war in Ukraine. Quoted by Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, he told reporters that NATO is an organisation which is hostile to us and which proves this hostility every day. Germany has signed contracts with Rheinmetall to restart the production of ammunition for the Gepard anti-aircraft guns it has delivered to Kyiv. Shipping in coastal communities around Ukraine's major seaport hub of Odessa received a warning from military officials today over the high risk of naval mines drifting along the coast and washing ashore. Although the Soviet-era mines were anchored to the seabed, some of them could have come loose in a storm and be carried by the current. Ukrainian defenders who have held out for months are braced for new ground attacks, obviously due to the reports today of a Russian offensive, but this according to Ukrainian military officials. The eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut is facing heavy artillery fire, according to local officials. President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Ukrainian soldiers for preventing occupiers from encircling Bakhmut. And in the last 3 days, the Wagner Group forces have almost certainly made further small gains around the northern outskirts of Bakhmut, including into the village of Krasna Hora, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. Ukraine's allies have begun training Ukrainian troops on the Leopard 2 and other modern battle tanks that had recently been the subject of a request for support from the Ukrainians. And finally, Moldova's president, Maya Sandu, has accused Russia of planning to use foreign saboteurs to overthrow her country's government, preventing it from joining the EU and to use it in the war against Ukraine. William, if I can just turn to that last part there, Moldova making very serious accusations today. And it's an area where Belarus, we know, is very much tied into the Russians. And I'm not quite sure where the Turkmenistan, the Uzbekistans and so on, where their compass is set looking towards the west or the east. But this idea of encroachment upon the rest of Europe, seems to be a great worry.
I think it is. We're hearing quite a bit of this just in the last 2 to 3 days. And obviously, with Russia considering starting an offensive, hardly surprising they're doing so with the first anniversary of the initial invasion coming up, because clearly it's a time of year that they feel able to, so they need to be seen to. But they do, I think, seem to be increasingly trying to muddy the waters and possibly, potentially, more perhaps with Belarus than with Moldova, seem to be opening up Ukraine to a war on two fronts, which really would be difficult. Hopefully, nothing will come of it now that the alarm has been sounded. But it's the sort of interference I think you'd be expecting Russia to run at this time. Putin is a wily operator, and this is just what he will do.
Indeed, and in further international news, I think we have all been very affected by what has been happening in the north of Turkey, the north of Syria and south of Turkey, as news today that 7 have been pulled from the rubble in Turkey as earthquake rescue passes 200 hours. 7 more people rescued 8 days after the massive earthquakes which hit Turkey and hit Syria. But hopes of finding further survivors of what the World Health Organization called the worst natural disaster in 100 years in its 53-country Europe region are dwindling. As a United Nations aid envoy entered stricken northwest Syria through a new crossing, the combined death toll rose to nearly 38,000, including nearly 32,000 in Turkey and at least 5,700 plus in the rebel-held and government-controlled parts of Syria, a figure that all expect to continue to rise. Among those recovered today were Mohammed Kafir, 18, who could be seen moving his fingers as he was lifted from rubble in Kahramanmaraş, Turkey. Mohammed Yenenar, 17, and his brother Baki, at age 21, were found alive in exactly the same region. Turkey's TRT reported a 35-year-old woman had also been pulled alive from the ruins of an apartment block in the southern Hatay province 250 hours after the first 7.8 magnitude quake struck early on Monday, the 6th of February. However, some teams are winding down operations as sub-zero temperatures reduce the already slim chances of survival. The United Nations aid chief Martin Griffiths has said that the rescue phase was coming to a close, with the focus turning now to shelter and the provision of food. The United Nations launched an appeal for $397 million today to help the earthquake victims in Syria, and the organisation's Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, added that the world body was in the final stages of a similar appeal for Turkey. In Turkey alone, an estimated 1 million people are living in tents and temporary shelters, whilst at least 80,000 people have been hospitalised. Up to 5 million people may be homeless in Syria, many already internally displaced after fleeing civil war. The UN Children's Agency UNICEF said that more than 7 million children had been affected by the quake and many thousands had died. Even without verified numbers, it is tragically clear that numbers will continue to grow, a spokesperson said today. Also today, the United Nations aid convoy of 11 trucks crossed into rebel-held northwestern Syria from Turkey through a newly opened crossing, Bab al-Salameh, and the first UN delegation to visit the war-torn area since last week's quake arrived, according to the AFP. The team is aiming to assess humanitarian and food needs in an area where 90% of the population, numbering about 4 million, were depending on aid even before the disaster struck. A Saudi plane carrying aid landed in Aleppo, with 2 more expected later this week. The UN welcomed the decision by the Syrian President Bashir al-Assad to open 2 more border crossings with Turkey for at least 3 months so more aid can reach the northwest, where 12 years of bitter fighting have vastly complicated the international relief effort. The head of the White Helmets main rescue group, Raid al-Salah, said the search for survivors in the northwest would soon come to an end. The indications we have are that there are not any, but we are trying to do our final checks, and in all sites, he was reported as saying. William, I started by saying we've all been affected by it. These are disasters that hit the television, and our connection to them. And I'm reading through there, and Aleppo was a place that was in the news in the last wee while for very different reasons, part of the war in Syria. Now it's a place where you're trying to get aid to support people. It's not an easy relief effort for them to conduct on the ground, is it?
No, but particularly Syria is a particular difficulty in this regard, and very much behind Turkey in terms of relief efforts. And that's simply because of the war situation there. And I think probably Assad was fairly slow in granting the access that was needed, and he did need to grant it because of all sorts of security considerations. So Syria is really playing catch up, and I know that words have been spoken amongst the aid agencies about the constraints that have been there. And it really is now, I suspect, past the time when we'll get very many more people rescued. So it is going to be a case of recovery, but then it's a case of what happens next. And how do you house people, and particularly in Syria, how do you house people that have been internally displaced by the war and all sorts of complications? I mean, we don't get normal life back for years, decades, possibly. It's the sort of natural disaster we do see, but it's a particularly severe one, and amongst the most severe this century of all types, and certainly in that area, as I've said. I think it's going to dwarf the 1939 earthquake that was, if you like, the big one in the past. And all we can do is offer our financial help and hope that the aid agencies can make something of it. But a huge task. And it's very difficult not to feel a sense of almost despair in amongst all the hope.
Indeed, and we go from a natural disaster that has happened to warnings of one that may be on its way, as the UN Secretary General has warned that rising seas threaten a mass exodus on what he described as a biblical scale. An increase in the pace at which sea levels are rising threatens this mass exodus of entire populations, according to the UN Secretary General. The climate crisis is causing sea levels to rise faster than for 3,000 years, bringing a torrent of trouble to almost 1 billion people, ranging from London to Los Angeles and Bangkok to Buenos Aires, Antonio Guterres said today. Some nations could cease to exist, drowned under the waves, he said. Addressing the UN Secretary Council, Mr. Guterres said, slashing carbon emissions, addressing problems such as poverty that worsen the impact of the rising seas on communities, and developing new international laws to protect those made homeless and even stateless were all needed. He said sea level rise was a threat multiplier, which by damaging lives, economies and infrastructure had dramatic implications for global peace and security. Significant sea level rise is already inevitable with current levels of global heating, but the consequences of failing to tackle the problem are unthinkable. Mr. Guterres said low-lying communities and entire countries could disappear forever. We would witness a mass exodus of entire populations on a biblical scale. And we would see ever fiercer competition for fresh water, for land, and for other resources. The International Law Commission is assessing the legal situation. In 2020, the United Nations Human Rights Committee ruled that it was unlawful for governments to return people to countries where their lives might be threatened by the climate crisis. A new compilation of data from the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, shows that sea levels are rising fast, and the global ocean has warmed faster over the past century than at any time in the past 11,000 100,000 years. Sea levels rise as warmer water expands and ice caps and glaciers melt. Well, William, holy Moses, it looks as though the environment is not waiting for us to get our ducks in a row. This almost feels as though we need a Hollywood solution with no Kevin Costner to attempt to bring this back into where it ought to be, and that is a recognition of the power of the natural forces in the world in which we live.
We underestimate natural forces at our peril. As for a Hollywood solution, well, a lot of Hollywood films perhaps turn on their characters having great changes of mind, or they see the light and they change their behavior, perhaps. But the human race needs to do that on an absolutely gargantuan scale. I mean, we're still seeing pushback or semi-pushback of COP26 and COP27 statements. We're seeing oil companies such as Shell just holding back on cutting the oil and the gas. This is the big story of the next 20 to 30 years. It's got a much longer horizon than that, but the bad stuff starts very soon if it hasn't already started, if we aren't already seeing it in some of the weather incidents that are going on. And it doesn't matter now what we do. This will be a big issue. And even a 1.5 degree target for the increase in temperature is a big stretch. A UN report just the other month said there's no credible pathway currently to that. So I said, if we do nothing, we're going to do worse than nothing. We're going to make things worse before we can possibly make them get better. And we need to completely change our attitude to migration, because forced migration is going to be a massive, massive issue for the world. And I don't think our current mindset is equipped to cope with the full ramifications of that. But the big statement that was made today in today's news bulletin, people's human rights do not disappear because their homes do. And we are going to have to remember that. And particularly with our somewhat unwilling attitude to migration that we're seeing, particularly in this country, but also in some other places, that has got to change radically.
Indeed, and we go from the change of a character, or turn on changing characters in Hollywood, to turning on former leaders in Holyrood, as Labour MSP Alex Rowley has called Gordon Brown's report on the future of the United Kingdom both stale and irrelevant. Ahead of its unveiling, Gordon Brown's report on the future of the Union at the Scottish Labour conference this very weekend, the Daily Record is reporting that splits on the Constitution have reopened in Scottish Labour after Alex Rowley, MSP, dismissed the report as exactly that, both stale and indeed irrelevant. Mr Rowley, who is a former deputy leader of Scottish Labour, also accused the party of trying to ignore the Constitution as an issue. Brown's latest plan makes a series of recommendations on Lord's reform and devolution of power, but some in the Scottish party were disappointed it did not contain a list of powers to devolve to Holyrood. Mr Rowley is reported to have said that the Brown report does not acknowledge how much further Scotland is down the road of devolution when compared with its neighbours, and fails to address the need for a new settlement between Scotland and the rest of the UK. SNP MSP Rona Mackey said, "It's telling how divided Scottish Labour is on the Constitution when Alex Rowley, a key lieutenant of Gordon Brown for many years, dismisses his old boss's plans as stale and irrelevant." William, we all know that when people leave a job, they often leave with an opinion or two with regards to why they've gone, but this seems an astonishing attack that seems almost to have come from nowhere on something that's about to be launched rather than out in the public domain in full. I know that we had a lot of discussion at one point where Gordon Brown had given his views on the Lords, but it just all seems to be the Labour Party eating itself.
Well, I'm sure that the knowledge that a large proportion of their supporters are also fairly keen on independence won't be entirely lost on all Labour politicians, although it may be lost on some of them. Scottish Labour seems to have been very, very slow to make any movement at all on the constitutional position. You could contrast that perhaps with Welsh Labour, that at least seemed to be able to entertain discussions about that country's future. To be fair to Alex Rowley, although he was a key lieutenant of Gordon Brown, I think he's always been on the wing of the party that is slightly disconcerted by Scottish Labour's fall in support here, and well aware of the reasons for it, which really it goes both before 2014, but certainly afterwards. The problem is, it's not entirely clear that Rowley's ideas will be any better than Gordon Brown's, because all it is about other bits of devolution, and we've heard it before. We have also begun now to see the absolute limits of devolution, when we can see Section 35s being both imposed and potentially threatened, and who knows where that leads. So the idea that Scotland can, in any sense, govern itself in a meaningful way, and that its politicians can be truly made responsible for how things go under the current devolution settlement, is a nonsense. No amount of constitutional tinkering is going to work now. I think devolution is either finished or we become independent. And you know where my view on that lies.
Indeed. And we move from internal Labour to Labour market statistics, which has been announced for October to December 2022, and it is the UK economy, which would appear to be suffering from the effects of stagflation from the latest labour market trends. It looks like a complex picture. The number of people looking for work rose while the number of job vacancies fell. Hours worked in the economy were down, while days lost were through strikes in 2022 were the highest annually since 1989. There was zero growth in the final 3 months of 2022, while the annual inflation stood at above 10%. Attempts made by the Bank of England to reduce inflationary pressure through higher interest rates are feeding into lower levels of activity. Commenting, the Scottish Government Employment Minister, Richard Lochhead, said, "The employment rate in Scotland remains high, despite the turbulent economic circumstances, including the continued impact of Brexit, high inflation and the cost of living crisis. The record high employment rate for all 16 to 64-year-olds and the joint record high employment rates for women are particularly welcome. The Scottish Government's ambitious plans for Scotland's economy set out in our national strategy for economic transformation are built on ensuring everyone can thrive in a diverse and inclusive workforce. Despite the high employment rate, certain sectors still face recruitment challenges. The Scottish Government is doing all it can to work with businesses and organisations to alleviate them. The UK Government holds key powers over migration, visas and key parts of employment law, and I repeat my calls for UK ministers to establish a joint task force on labour market shortages." William, if I could pick up just, you were talking earlier on about the way in which we look at migration in the United Kingdom. I would say probably as a whole, that there tends to be those on the right who see it as a negative, and those in reality who see the positivity of it and the need for it. And when it comes to labour market statistics, here's yet another economic pressure. We've seen many industries within Scotland suffering from a lack of those transient workers and those temporary workers who would come in order to support and help us out. But now the stagflation, the stagnancy of the economy, the Truss economic budget that went bizarre, Brexit and so on. It's no longer just a perfect storm. It's like an imperfect tsunami of things hitting. But there's a robust nature, and again, when we talk about high employment rates, we should not be fooled into believing that they're all paying £500 a week, starting on a Monday at 9 and finish at 10 past. Many of these are at the lower level of the economic sector.
Yeah, I think Resolution Foundation commented with regard to the UK as a whole that the fallen economic inactivity, of which there has been some, is very much fueled by the rise in zero hours contracts. It's lovely having decentish, compared to the UK employment figures, 76.6% employment rate as against 75.6. But there's no point in having all that employment if it doesn't pay properly. And that is the fundamental issue we face with um, pay rises in the private, but more markedly in the public sector, not being near the sort of inflation that people are experiencing. So increasingly, in a world where even if you're employed or you've got two jobs in your household, you're struggling to pay bills. That's iniquitous, but it's also daft, because that is a restraint in itself on the economy. It's also very unfair because the deck is stacked against ordinary people, and the numbers of working people that are currently in need of food banks is growing, and an absolute scandal. So, yeah, a perfect tsunami. I wish that the UK government, for it is the UK government that has the powers to do so, had some sort of indication that it knew how to control the weather that's causing that. But I don't see it, and I see perhaps a year or two of really quite severe hardship for people to follow now. And once the economy's taken that sort of pummeling, it takes a wee while to come back. It was remarkable that a growth rate of zero was almost treated with a sense of relief that it wasn't actually a recession. But we're at the stage where that hardly matters anymore, with the disparity in wealth being what it is.
Indeed, and we move from some sort of control that we hope that the UK government has to the UK government attempting to prove that they have some sort of control, as this week we hear that a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol may well be ready, possibly by next week. Negotiations over the protocol are in a crucial final phase, with a deal possibly going to be out as early as next week, according to various reports. Rishi Sunak is expected to spend the latter half of the Westminster recess this week looking at the shape of the deal, with calls penciled in with EU leaders. However, British sources have stressed that talks were at a delicate phase and there was no guarantee of a final agreement. Any deal would mean the UK agreeing to drop the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, the use of which would unilaterally override the current agreement and prompt legal action from Brussels. The bill is in the House of Lords, but its progress has been frozen. The announcement of any deal will depend on time to square off any concerns from European Union member states, and most crucially, parties in Northern Ireland, including the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, which is blocking the formation of a power-sharing government at Stormont. The European Union are still being cautious, warning that Brussels would still insist that the European Court of Justice will remain the ultimate arbiter of any dispute under the Northern Ireland Protocol. The European Union believes the main work is to be done in the UK, not between the Commission and the United Kingdom. Today, The Telegraph reported that the UK had agreed that the European Court of Justice would be the ultimate arbiter in matters of EU law in Northern Ireland, though there would be an extended role for Northern Irish courts. This would reflect practice before Brexit, with trade and commercial disputes heard first in national courts. A key question will be whether the treaty will need to be rewritten, which the EU has said is impossible, or whether additions can be made without redrafting, as the UK had insisted needed to take place. If the text is not reopened, it could be agreed by the Protocol's Joint Committee. Prime Minister Sunak may be able to avoid a Commons confrontation with hardline Brexiters in the party, as the changes are unlikely to necessitate a formal vote in Parliament. But the biggest risk for Sunak would be a high-profile intervention. This is a pimple wrapped in a conundrum filled with myths and mythsters and its mysteries. It just is something that seems impenetrable. But apparently, Rishi Sunak has a magic wand, and it looks as though all is going to be purple rainbows next week and it's all going to be fine. What's the chances?
I think there's a great deal of caution being expressed by some UK sources. Rishi Sunak is not one to express that sort of concern. He's all very, hi, I'm Rishi, I'll fix things. And yes, indeed, it's unicorns and magic wands. But the Northern Ireland situation with regard to Brexit was always the hardest bit to solve. It's the ultimate squaring of a circle. And I suspect there's quite a long distance to go yet. It will never be supported by the DUP. I think the DUP is something like 7 red lines, and there's no agreement that's going to get round all 7 of them. But they need to arrive at some sort of solution that makes things work without it being a ridiculous trochel just trying to get goods through, whether that comes down to red and green lanes in Northern Ireland ports, and the red ones are the ones going south and the green ones are the ones that where the goods are just going to be used in Northern Ireland. That's a possibility. So there is room for manoeuvre. And of course, the Tory government does not depend on the DUP as the previous Tory government might have done. So maybe there's something there. Why Scotland should be interested is because if they can sort the Northern Ireland issues out, that takes a lot of sting out of all the arguments that we would hear about how troublesome a Scottish border with England would be if Scotland was planning to be in the EU again. So it's one we should watch, and I hesitate to say wish them well. I do hope, though, that they get something sorted out, but I'm not holding my breath.
Indeed, and from a point where the province of Ulster says no to refusals in another place domestically, as the Department for Work and Pensions sanctions have reached new peaks as the cost of living is biting. Sanctions handed out by the DWP to people in universal credit across the UK have reached a new peak of just under 7%, new figures have shown. The statistics released today also show that nearly 100,000 sanctions have been handed out to universal credit claimants in Scotland since May 2016. Sanction rates have sharply increased since the pandemic, from just over 2.5% of claimants in Scotland, England and Wales being sanctioned to the new record levels. Commenting, the SNP Social Justice spokesperson David Linden MP said the DUP's sanction regime sums up the callous approach the Tories have taken to social security. Instead of providing a robust safety net for millions of households, the surge in sanctions demonstrates the uncaring approach of the UK government, which is pushing people further into poverty during a cost of living crisis created by the Tories. It is a tale of two governments for the people of Scotland, as the Scottish Government's social security and employability system does not hand out sanctions and works for the people through fairness, dignity and respect, whereas the callous UK Government works against the people who need it most. Well, you'll never forget the people that are likely to pay you back at the polls. This is incredibly worrying given where we are. I think that in a time of some form of economic prosperity, the sanctioning of those in benefits might well be seen by large numbers of the people as a shrug of the shoulders, not really concerned, but this is beginning to seep into almost everybody's day and daily life. And I find it astonishing.
It is a completely different attitude that the UK government has had in recent years to the social security system, and we should call it the social security system, I think, not the welfare system. So David Linden is absolutely right in his terminology. I think that it can only get worse. I think the new rules that have come in saying that you need to be spending, or seen to be spending, a minimum of 15 hours job hunting, not 12, it just gives people another hurdle to fall over. And it seems all very arbitrary, and I suspect without proper process that people are being basically left on their uppers with nothing else available to them. I think it's a stretch system that's punishing vulnerable people despite its own inadequacies, and sometimes because of them. And I look forward to the day when all of social security has finally come over to the Scottish Government, and we can work with a system that really works for people, for the recipients of the necessary payments, rather than seemingly against them, because it's one more stress they simply do not need.
Indeed, and going from news of kicking people when they're down to calls for the United Kingdom government to match the Scottish child payment. It comes on the second anniversary of the introduction of a game-changing Scottish child payment. The SNP has challenged today the UK government to follow Scotland's lead by matching the £440 million commitment to combating child poverty. The Scottish Child Payment was first opened on February the 14th, 2021 to eligible families with children under 6. Initially, the payment was £10 per week per child, doubled in April 2022 to £20 per week before being rolled out to families with children under 16 years old in November last year, and increased again to £25 per week per eligible child. Commenting on the anniversary, SNP MSP Emma Roddick said, in just 2 years, the SNP Scottish Government has introduced and increased the Scottish Child Payment for thousands of families. It represents close to a £500 million boost to low-income families a year, and has rightly been described as a game changer in the fight to combat child poverty. In contrast, the Tories at Westminster have inflicted more than a decade of austerity on the hardest pressed, and their abject failure to get a grip of the current cost of living crisis is forcing millions of families and children into or further into poverty and destitution, imposing anti-family policies and like the benefit cap and rape clause. Ms Roddick went on to say, make no mistake, this is a political choice. The Tories could choose a different path by following the Scottish Government's lead. They have the power to implement a policy UK-wide for a £25 a week payment to help children in hard-pressed households. Again, two different approaches, this time Scotland suggesting to the UK government that they might want to follow, but they seem unwilling to be led.
Oh, of course, they're unwilling to be led. It's very interesting to hear Scottish government ministers challenging the UK to follow them, because usually it's the UK saying, why should Scotland be different? Why Scotland should be different is simply because of, I think, who we are. And I think the Scottish Child Payment and the rest of the emerging Scottish social security system is much, much closer to who we are as a people, and robust yet fair, and with the end customer in mind. That has never, I think, been particularly the attitude in England, particularly under Tory governments, who seem to see benefits as being something to be cut and kept as low as possible, as if it were somehow dead money that can't be afforded. What it is, of course, is money that will be spent by the recipients and will circulate again in the economy. So it makes absolute sense to pay a reasonable amount that might have a chance of staving off at least the worst effects of poverty, in the knowledge that you'll get some of it back and you will avoid the much greater payments that you might have to shell out later to get people out of the financial trouble that they're in because you didn't provide the money in the first place. So, yeah, by all means, let's tell the UK government that this is the way for them. But as with so many things this evening, I am not holding my breath about any sort of meaningful response. Maybe Alistair Jack will stir himself to say something patrician at some point, but that'll be about it.
Indeed, Alistair Jack saying something patrician is an interesting idea, not an ideal. But there is, and you pointed this out, there is a common link that seems, whether it be the migration crisis or the difference in figures in terms of the economy and also employment rates and so forth. There's a difference between both the UK-wide approach to it and the Scottish approach, but also a difference in terms of how people view things. That the UK government seems to have a view that migration is bad, benefits are bad, everything that costs us is bad, whereas there's an increasing amount of evidence that this is not expenditure, this is investment. It's investment in people, it's investment in your economy, it's an investment in a society and a community that should have the opportunity to cut the cord and be free.
Yeah, I think that is the way to look at it. But particularly the Tory government has really got its own fairly extreme now supporters to always pander to, if you like. A lot of the rhetoric on all of these topics is dog whistle stuff because it's how they see they maintain their support. And I'll talk about, ironically, there being no magic money tree when having your own currency is a money tree, let's face it. And you know, it just doesn't seem to be a consideration that money should be available to everyone and not just for the better off who presumably don't have too much to worry about right now because they'll have feather-bedded corporate profits to roll about in. More and more, I think that we are a fundamentally different country from England, and as it now is, and maybe always was, and that we need to begin to realise it, but also to be talking about it amongst ourselves. This is where the Yes movement has to reach out and find the common ground with people who are currently no voters, but don't like the way things are and think we might be able to do things better. And I think if the Yes movement could do that, we might just begin to shift the dial a wee bit further up the scale of let's do things for ourselves. Let's take that leap.
And fundamentally, from one part of the world, we move to another country where 3 people have been killed in a shooting spree on Michigan State University campus. At least 3 people killed, several more injured in a shooting there, according to campus police. The suspected attacker died from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. University police tweeted on Monday that shots were fired in 2 locations, nearing an academic building called Barclay Hall and an athletic facility known as IM East. Michigan State University, MSU, police initially ordered students and staff to shelter in places after a report of shots fired around the school's East Lansing campus. An alert was sent shortly after 8:30 p.m. by the university's police department advising students to run, hide and fight. After searches that went on for more than 4 hours, MSU police announced at midnight Tuesday morning that the suspected shooter had been found dead off campus. While appealing for information from the public, the police said it was unclear what the motive for the attack may have been, and work to identify the suspect was ongoing. At an emotional morning press conference in East Lansing today, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer denounced the uniquely American problem of gun violence, saying, "We cannot keep living like this." The Democratic governor noted that today marked exactly 5 years since 17 students and staff were killed in Florida in the worst high school shooting in the United States. William, we've had that here in Dunblane. There was the Hungerford massacre before. There have been no massacres since because a fairly simple solution was found. In America, you can see the power of the commercial lobby at work. If there's any greater example of how sense and sensibility are thrown out when greenbacks are on the table, I cannot think of one. I don't know what will take the American people to wake up to actually ban guns or stop their distribution in exactly the way they are currently being done just now.
I'm afraid I can't help you. It seems to be an intractable problem because of the vested interests. And although Gretchen Whitmer may say we cannot go on living like this. That's exactly what the US has been doing. Um, Incidents like this very often stimulate only recommendations that more people should have guns so that they can protect themselves. But the statistics for America are so far out of line with other countries, it's ridiculous. But what can change it? I recall, I thought the thing that would change it roughly 10 years ago would have been Sandy Hook, where very like Dunblane in its way, but obviously repeated in so many others since. With Sandy Hook, I happened to have a 6-year-old niece in America, another part of America at that time, and I remember writing an impassioned blog about how things should change. And I got the longest response I ever got to a blog. It was twice the length of what I'd written. Just putting the case of the Second Amendment and we've got to have guns and that's the way it's got to be. It's fixed in there. It's cemented in there in the American psyche. So I sadly don't think it will ever shift. And I think that maybe other things will have to be done about it. I would be concerned if you can't do anything about guns, can you do something about mental health? Because that is, I think, a driver in a lot of cases, not just the availability of guns, but the predisposition to use them. We don't know what the motives of this latest gunman are. Apparently, he's left a 2-page memo, but it's not entirely clear what it was that drove him to do this. He was not affiliated with the university. We may never know. We probably won't. But yeah, I agree that you can't go on living like this because it's not living after a while. It's just hanging on. But I suspect America will be faced with it for many, many years to come.
And I suppose the worry that we all have is that incidents like this shock and horrify people. But there are people out there who it emboldens. I remember the incident in New Zealand with the attack on the mosques. And it was reported that in the wake of that, attacks on mosques in the United Kingdom multiplied 5-fold. That it was not shock at what happened that meant that people examined their opinions and their views, but for some, it emboldened them to believe that this was the way to do things. And if there's not some form of swift action in order to address that, the ripple effect it has can go far and wide. And I also thought, Sandy Hook would be the thing that did it. And this last 6 months with Alec Jones being fined that humongous amount of money, which will be no doubt overturned in appeal. And, he was a Sandy Hook denier. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think it was, running along, trying to question some survivor and calling him an actor, and it hadn't really happened, and having to row back. But she's in the news last week for shouting at the State of Union address at President Joe Biden. It just seems that right now, if Westminster is the mother of parliaments, then the illegitimate child of democracy seems to be in America unable to control itself.
I couldn't put it any better. There are big problems. There are problems everywhere, but America seems to amplify its problems, and I don't really see a way out. But as a species, we have to learn to look after ourselves better to ensure that this sort of thing is less likely to happen, and maybe that will bring a slow end to it. But and you're right about emboldening people, because although we are nothing like the US, and no other country really is, we will see incidents here over the coming decades. They'll be infrequent, but they'll be shocking, and they might lead to some changes. But there's a fundamental part of the human condition that brings this about. It just so happens that in the US, it's exacerbated by this love affair they have with guns.
Indeed. And finally, this evening, we move back into Scotland, and A lot better news, as disabled children have received £130 million since the launch of the Scottish Child Disability Payment. More than £130 million has been distributed to thousands of families with disabled children since the launch of this particular Scottish Government benefit. The latest official figures show that families of over 54,000 children and young people were receiving child disability payment in just December of last year. Just over 13,000 of these are from new applications. More than 41,000 children and young people have had their award transferred from the Disability Living Allowance for Children from the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP, to child disability payments. Social Security Scotland are on course to have transferred the awards of almost everyone still receiving the Disability Living Allowance, or DLA, for children in Scotland by spring. Child disability payment helps cover the extra costs of caring for a disabled or terminally ill child or young person. And the Minister for Social Security, Ben McPherson, said child disability payments help parents to support their children and assist young people to live their lives to the fullest. Therefore, it is welcome news that so far more than £130 million in child disability payments have been distributed to thousands of families with disabled children to help cover extra costs. New applications are increasing, and Social Security Scotland is working to process these as quickly as they can, while seeking to ensure that right decisions are made first time. We are only being asked to look again at decisions in a very small proportion of cases. There we are, William. If I was going to find something that would define the difference between north and south in this sceptred isle of ours, a government minister applauding the fact they've spent money. How good's that?
Well, it's an investment. It's not just a dead cost. The other thing that characterises the approach here is that the new benefit has been designed in partnership with people who have experience in applying for benefits, and in consequence of that, it's easier to access, and the fundamental principles of dignity, fairness, and respect. I think that may be why as many as 13,000 of the 54,000 children who are receiving this as of last year are new applications. I wonder how many of those applications would have been accepted under the UK Disability Living Allowance scheme. So this steady switchover of benefits system from the DWP to Scotland is very welcome, and probably a wee bit slower than we might have expected or hoped for, but I'd rather we did get it right than rush it. And hats off to them, and long may that continue. Let's continue to do things better than Westminster, because that's not currently a narrative we hear very much in the mainstream media.
Indeed, and that is it for this evening. And before I wind up, can I thank my guest, my esteemed guest, William Duguid. Always a pleasure to have you here, and thank you very much for tonight.
Thank you.
And so, that is indeed it all for this evening, this Valentine's evening. And before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We know how difficult times are, but as our programmes will always be free to view, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, allowing us to employ people to make the programmes here. We have set ourselves a target, an ambitious target, of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to do just that, to make more programmes, employ staff, and those people who also are in the Twitter sphere or on Facebook or whatever social media platform is where you spend some of your time. It is always great to have these programmes tweeted out or sent out on social media. It leads to more subscribers, more people knowing what's going on, and therefore they can access the news from a Scottish perspective. So, Valentine's night, love. We talked about love for the planet. We hoped that there would be love for fellow man over in America. But from here we are in Scotland, where dignity, fairness and respect is the love that we want for all. It's good night and thank you for watching.